The morning arrives so quietly that it almost seems to appear without moving. Long before the sun climbs above the distant hills, the world is already awake in its own gentle way. The wind has been traveling through fields during the night. Water has continued to slip over smooth stones in the nearby stream. Small insects have hidden beneath leaves, and the stars have slowly surrendered their places to a sky that grows pale with patient light. Somewhere in a village, before anyone speaks a single word, a wooden door opens. Cool air enters a small home built from timber, clay, and careful hands. The smell of yesterday's fire still rests inside the room. A few glowing coals hide beneath gray ash, waiting for someone to stir them back to life. A young person rises quietly from a simple bed filled with straw. There is no need for anyone to call their name. Morning itself has become the invitation. The blanket is folded with familiar care. Bare feet touch the cool earth floor. Outside, birds begin their first songs, never in a hurry, never trying to be louder than the morning itself. This young person is not unusual. They could have lived in many places across history. Perhaps in a farming village where generations stayed close to the same fields. Perhaps inside the stone walls of a quiet town where crafts filled every narrow street. Perhaps near forests where woodcutters knew every tree by its shape. Perhaps beside a river where fishermen measured the seasons not by calendars but by the return of certain birds. Their name is not important. Their face is unknown to us. Yet their life was shared by countless others. Tonight, as we wander slowly through the quiet paths of history, we will not follow kings, generals, or famous travelers. Their stories have often been told. Instead, we will stay beside someone much easier to overlook. Someone young. Someone learning. Someone growing inside a world where nearly everything already seemed decided. A world of order. A world where each person usually knew where they belonged before they could even speak. Where work waited patiently for every pair of hands. Where family carried memories older than anyone still living. Where customs quietly shaped each day without needing to be explained. It was not always an easy life. But it was often a predictable one. And predictability, for many people, became its own kind of comfort. So allow the pace of the day to slow. Imagine soft morning light entering through a small window. Imagine smoke rising gently from a chimney. Imagine distant sheep bells carried by cool air. The village is beginning another ordinary day. For the young, ordinary days were where almost everything important happened. When children were very small, the world felt close. A single home contained nearly everything they needed to understand. The walls protected them from winter winds. The fire offered warmth. The table gathered everyone together. Every object had a purpose. Every tool had its place. A wooden spoon might remain in the same family for many years. A clay bowl could survive through countless meals. A woven basket might carry grain every harvest until its handle slowly wore smooth beneath familiar fingers. Nothing hurried. Nothing wished to become something else. Children watched these quiet routines before they understood them. They learned by seeing. By listening. By waiting. A mother kneading dough. A father sharpening a blade. An older sister spinning wool. A grandfather repairing a broken handle. Each movement repeated itself so often that it became part of memory long before words could explain it. There were very few lessons separated from life. Life itself was the lesson. The seasons taught time. The weather taught patience. Animals taught responsibility. Families taught belonging. Even silence had something to teach. A child sitting beside an elder during a long winter evening might hear almost nothing for many minutes. Only the crackling fire. Only quiet breathing. Only the gentle tapping of knitting needles. Yet those silent moments slowly shaped how people understood calm. Today, silence often feels empty. Long ago, silence often felt full. It held comfort. It held trust. No one felt required to fill every moment with speech. As children grew older, the world slowly became larger. Not through travel. Most people would spend nearly all their lives within familiar landscapes. Instead, the world grew because responsibilities grew. The path to the well became their path too. The small garden needed another pair of hands. Animals recognized another gentle voice. A broom fit comfortably into growing hands. Simple work arrived gradually. No ceremony announced it. One day, someone simply said it was time. Carry this basket. Gather those eggs. Watch your younger brother. Bring water before sunset. Feed the chickens. Stack the wood. The tasks were rarely difficult alone. Together, repeated over months and years, they quietly shaped character. Children discovered that work was not always exciting. Most work never was. Yet there could be peace inside repetition. The sound of grain falling into storage bins. The steady rhythm of sweeping. The familiar weight of a bucket balanced carefully. The gentle scratching of hens searching for insects. These sounds became the music of everyday life. No audience watched. No applause followed. The reward often arrived simply as another peaceful evening. Growing older did not happen suddenly. There was no single morning when childhood disappeared. Instead, people noticed tiny changes. Clothing became slightly larger. Voices slowly deepened. Responsibilities quietly increased. Adults trusted young people with more important tasks. Sometimes that trust felt heavy. Sometimes it felt wonderful. A young shepherd might spend long afternoons alone with sheep grazing on distant hillsides. There, surrounded by open sky, they learned something impossible to teach inside walls. Patience. Sheep rarely hurried. Clouds never rushed. The wind followed no schedule. Hours unfolded gently. A shepherd learned to watch carefully. To notice which animal wandered farther than the others. To recognize changing weather by the smell carried across grass. To understand that quiet observation often solved problems before they became serious. Many young people learned similar lessons through different work. The apprentice inside a workshop. The helper beside fishermen. The daughter weaving beside her mother. The son carrying tools behind his father. Every trade possessed its own rhythm. Every rhythm slowly entered the body. Hands remembered movements before the mind fully understood them. The homes where young people lived were usually busy places. Families often shared space with grandparents, younger children, visiting relatives, and sometimes workers or apprentices. Privacy was rare. Life happened together. Morning meals. Evening conversations. Repairs. Cooking. Mending. Planning. Storytelling. Everything unfolded within shared rooms. Children heard adult conversations not because they were invited, but because walls could not keep voices apart. They learned family history naturally. Who had survived difficult winters? Who had planted the old apple tree? Who had married into another village? Who remembered the Great Flood? Memory lived through conversation. Books existed, but many families owned none. Stories became libraries. Voices became history. The young also learned where they stood inside the larger community. Every village possessed its own invisible map. Not of roads. Of relationships. Everyone knew who baked bread. Who repaired wagons. Who kept bees. Who cared for horses. Who possessed the finest orchard. Who always offered help during harvest. Who sang beautifully during festivals. Who remembered old songs. Children absorbed these details slowly. Without realizing it, they learned that no one truly lived alone. Every household depended upon another. The blacksmith needed farmers. Farmers needed millers. Millers needed carpenters. Carpenters needed foresters. The web connected everyone. Young people entered that web little by little. There were rules. Many rules. Some spoken. Some never spoken. Respect elders. Care for younger children. Do not waste food. Finish work before resting. Keep promises. Speak honestly. Share when possible. Protect family honor. These ideas appeared again and again in countless places across history. Not every family followed them perfectly. No family ever did. People argued. People made mistakes. Young people forgot instructions. Adults lost patience. Yet the ideals remained. Order depended upon everyone trying again tomorrow. The changing seasons guided youth more than birthdays ever could. Spring meant fresh work. Summer meant longer days. Autumn meant gathering. Winter meant waiting. Children measured growth through harvests. I was this small during the last planting. I carried only one bundle last winter. I can lift more now. The land itself became a calendar. Every returning season reminded them how much had quietly changed. Friendships formed naturally. There was little time separated entirely by age. Older children helped younger ones. Younger children admired older ones. Games often appeared between chores. A stick became a toy. A smooth stone became treasure. Running races across fields required nothing except open ground. Laughter echoed between trees. Then someone remembered another task waiting. The game paused. Work returned. Neither seemed unusual. Life flowed gently between both. Evening arrived slowly. Smoke drifted above rooftops. Dogs settled beside doorways. The last light rested softly across fields now empty of workers. Families gathered once again indoors. Soup simmered quietly. Fresh bread cooled upon wooden boards. Someone repaired clothing beneath fading light. Someone else untangled fishing nets. Children listened more than they spoke. Adults discussed weather, harvest, neighbors, animals, simple concerns, simple hopes. The fire became brighter as darkness filled the room. Outside, the village grew wonderfully still. No engines. No distant machines. Only insects. Wind. Perhaps an owl somewhere beyond the fields. The young looked into the flames while adults continued speaking. Firelight has a remarkable way of slowing thought. It did then. It still does now. The shadows upon the walls moved gently, almost like silent companions. Another day had passed. Not remarkable. Not unforgettable. Simply complete. And for most people throughout history, it was these ordinary days, repeated hundreds and then thousands of times across generations, that quietly built a life. No grand adventure announced the beginning of adulthood. No single moment transformed a child into someone older. Instead, youth unfolded like the seasons themselves. Almost too slowly to notice. almost too gently to measure. Yet with every sunrise, every shared meal, every careful chore, and every quiet evening beside the fire, another small thread was woven into the fabric of a person's life. The village settled into sleep beneath a sky filled with steady stars. Tomorrow would arrive much like today. And for a young person growing within a world shaped by order, that gentle certainty was not something to escape. It was simply the way the world had always breathed. Morning returned with the same gentle certainty that it always had. The darkness slowly softened into shades of gray. The first light touched the tops of distant trees before reaching the roofs of the village. Thin trails of smoke climbed into the cool air, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood. Somewhere nearby, a rooster greeted the day, though no one truly needed its call. Most people had already begun to stir. Inside the small homes, blankets were folded away. The warmth of sleep slowly gave way to the cool feeling of another ordinary morning. Hands reached for wooden shoes waiting beside the bed. Someone stretched quietly. Someone else added another piece of wood to the fire. Nothing happened quickly. There was little reason for haste. Another day had arrived, and it would ask for many small efforts rather than one great achievement. For the young, every morning carried a quiet reminder. There was always something to learn. Not because anyone announced a lesson, but because every task held a small piece of knowledge hidden inside it. A basket could teach balance. A loaf of bread could teach patience. A field could teach observation. Even sweeping a floor revealed something about care, because dust always returned, and good work was never finished forever. It simply waited to be done again. This understanding became part of growing older. Many things in life were not completed once. They were cared for again and again. A young person stepping outside after breakfast would notice the village waking in stages. An old woman slowly opened her shutters. A farmer crossed the lane carrying a wooden rake over one shoulder. Two children hurried toward the well with empty buckets, trying to arrive before the line became longer. A dog stretched lazily beneath a cart. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air from a nearby oven. None of these sights seemed unusual, because they happened almost every day. Yet together they formed the quiet rhythm of community. Everyone's morning connected with everyone else's. The baker depended on the miller. The miller depended on the farmer. The farmer depended on rain. The rain depended on nothing at all. Young people slowly noticed these invisible connections. Perhaps not in words, but through experience. They understood that every household played a small part in keeping the village alive. Children were rarely left without purpose. Even those too young for difficult work often found themselves carrying messages, gathering kindling, feeding chickens, or watching younger brothers and sisters. These small responsibilities taught something deeper than skill. They taught reliability. Adults watched carefully. Not with harsh eyes, but with experienced ones. Could this child remember instructions? Would they return when asked? Could they be trusted with simple tasks? Trust grew slowly. Like a tree. One careful season after another. No parent expected perfection. Mistakes happened. Water spilled. Eggs cracked. Wood was stacked unevenly. A forgotten bucket remained beside the well until evening. Adults sighed. Children apologized. Tomorrow brought another chance. Learning was rarely separated from error. Instead, mistakes became ordinary companions on the long road toward adulthood. In many places, clothing quietly reflected age. Very young children often wore simple garments made from rough cloth. As they grew older, clothes slowly changed. Not because fashion demanded it, because work demanded it. A stronger belt helped carry small tools. Longer sleeves protected skin during outdoor labor. Sturdier shoes lasted through muddy paths. A heavier cloak guarded against winter winds. Nothing was chosen only for appearance. Nearly everything served a purpose. Young people learned to value usefulness. A carefully mended coat could be more respected than a brand new one. Every patch told a story. Every repaired seam spoke of careful hands. Nothing was wasted if it could still serve another season. The world of tools fascinated many children. Axes rested beside chopping blocks. Wooden spades leaned against fences. Iron knives hung safely out of reach until older hands were trusted to use them. Each tool carried quiet importance. Adults did not simply hand them over. Instead, they demonstrated. Slowly. Patiently. Hold it like this. Keep your fingers here. Watch the grain of the wood. Feel how the blade moves. There were no printed manuals. Knowledge passed from hand to hand. Eye to eye. Generation to generation. A young apprentice often learned by watching far longer than by speaking. Observation became its own education. Not every lesson involved work. Many involved manners. Respect shaped nearly every conversation. Children learned when to speak. When to remain silent. How to greet visitors. How to offer food before serving themselves. How to thank neighbors who shared help during difficult times. These customs varied from place to place. But nearly everywhere, respect held communities together. The young noticed that adults often greeted each other by asking about health, family, harvest, or weather. Simple questions. Gentle questions. The kind that reminded everyone they belonged to one another. Meals arrived at familiar times. Breakfast was often modest. Bread. Porridge. Perhaps cheese. Perhaps yesterday's stew warmed once again. Fresh fruit appeared only when the seasons offered it. Nothing seemed unusual about eating what the land provided. Children quickly learned which foods belonged to summer. Which belonged to autumn. Which waited patiently in storage through winter. The changing menu quietly marked the passing year. Spring greens. Sweet berries. Fresh milk. Warm bread. Dried beans. Salted meat. Root vegetables resting beneath cool soil. Each meal carried the memory of previous work. Someone had planted. Someone had harvested. Someone had preserved. Nothing reached the table by accident. As the morning continued, different paths carried young people toward different futures. One child followed sheep across rolling hills. Another entered a carpenter's workshop. Another remained beside a spinning wheel. Another joined family members in the fields. Some learned trades. Some learned farming. Some learned weaving. Some learned healing from older relatives who understood herbs and roots gathered from forests and meadows. Each path seemed ordinary to those walking it. Few imagined entirely different lives. Most expected to continue the work surrounding them since childhood. This expectation did not always feel like a burden. Sometimes it felt comforting. The future seemed visible. Not mysterious. Not uncertain. Simply waiting. Inside workshops, mornings unfolded with quiet concentration. A blacksmith's apprentice swept the floor before touching iron. A potter's helper prepared clay before shaping vessels. A cooper's assistant gathered wooden staves before barrels could be built. Preparation always came first. Young people discovered that beautiful work often depended upon invisible effort. Hours spent organizing, cleaning, sharpening, sorting. Only later came the finished object. Visitors admired polished tables, strong barrels, fine shoes, well-made baskets. Few noticed the many quiet mornings that made such work possible. The apprentice noticed, because the apprentice lived inside those mornings. Sometimes young people grew impatient. That was perfectly natural. Watching adults perform skilled work often inspired excitement. I can do that. Let me try. I already know. Experienced hands usually smiled. Then reply gently. Not yet. Those simple words appeared again and again throughout history. Not yet. Skill required time. Wood could not be hurried into becoming furniture. Neither could children be hurried into becoming masters. The seasons themselves reminded everyone of this truth. Seeds did not bloom the day after planting. Fruit arrived only after long months of quiet growth. Young people slowly accepted that they too were growing in ways difficult to measure. Weather shaped nearly every day. Clouds mattered. Wind mattered. Rain mattered. A young person soon learned to read the sky almost without thinking. Dark clouds gathering beyond distant hills. Birds flying lower than usual. The smell of moisture carried on cool air. The sudden stillness before rain. Nature often spoke softly before changing. Those who listened carefully prepared themselves. An extra bundle of firewood gathered before storms. Animals guided toward shelter. Laundry brought indoors. Grain protected beneath coverings. Observation became another quiet skill of youth. Not every day remained peaceful. Animals wandered away. Tools broke unexpectedly. Heavy rain flooded low fields. Illness sometimes entered homes without warning. These moments reminded young people that order required constant care. Life could become difficult. Yet communities rarely faced hardship entirely alone. Neighbors appeared carrying buckets, sharing food, helping repair damaged fences, watching children while parents cared for the sick. Young people witnessed these acts of kindness, often without anyone announcing that kindness itself was the lesson. It simply became another ordinary part of village life. Afternoons often felt slower. The brightest sunlight rested over fields. Workers paused briefly beneath trees. Water tasted especially cool after hours of labor. Bread shared outdoors somehow seemed more satisfying than bread eaten indoors. Children sometimes lay upon warm grass for a few quiet moments before returning to chores. Clouds drifted overhead without concern. Bees moved patiently among flowers. Somewhere nearby, a cowbell echoed gently across open land. Nothing extraordinary happened. And that was enough. History is often remembered through dramatic moments. But most lives were built from afternoons exactly like these. As daylight slowly began to soften, work gradually drew toward its end. Tools were cleaned. Animals counted. Doors secured. Water buckets filled for evening use. The pace naturally slowed. No bell announced the transition. The changing light itself guided everyone home. The village breathed differently at dusk. Children's voices became quieter. Birdsong changed. Smoke once again rose from chimneys. The familiar scent of supper spread gently through narrow lanes. Inside each home, another evening gathered family together. The fire glowed warmly. Simple meals appeared upon wooden tables. Someone offered thanks. Someone passed bread. Someone quietly told a story remembered from long ago. Young people listened closely. Not because stories always carried excitement, but because stories carried belonging. Every tale connected the present to those who had lived before. A grandfather remembered his own youth. A grandmother described winters from many years earlier. Parents recalled lessons learned through mistakes. Children absorbed these memories one peaceful evening at a time. Without realizing it, they became the next keepers of those stories. Outside, darkness slowly settled across fields now resting beneath the first stars. The wind moved gently through tall grass. The village grew quiet once more. Inside warm homes, young hearts and growing minds drifted toward sleep, carrying with them another day of simple work, quiet learning, familiar voices, and gentle routines. Nothing remarkable had happened. And yet, everything important had continued. Because in a world shaped by order, growing up was rarely marked by great events. It happened through ordinary mornings, careful afternoons, peaceful evenings, and countless small moments that quietly gathered together, like drops of rain filling a patient stream. Night had passed almost unnoticed. The stars had crossed their familiar paths above the quiet village. A pale moon had watched over sleeping fields, empty roads, and dark rooftops before slowly fading into the first light of dawn. The world had continued its gentle turning, asking nothing of anyone while they rested. Inside the homes, the warmth of yesterday's fire had become a bed of glowing embers once again. A careful hand stirred the ashes. A few dry twigs were placed on top. Then a larger piece of wood. Within moments, thin ribbons of smoke curled upward, followed by small orange flames that slowly stretched awake. The room filled with a comforting warmth that seemed to belong as much to memory as to the fire itself. For many young people, this was one of the first sights of nearly every morning. Fire before breakfast. Warmth before work. Light before sunrise. These simple beginnings remained almost unchanged through countless generations. The fire was more than comfort. It cooked meals, dried damp clothing, warmed cold hands, heated water, gathered the family together. It was difficult to imagine daily life without it. Children learned to respect it from a very early age. Not through fear alone, but through careful instruction. Move slowly. Keep your sleeves away from the flames. Never leave burning wood unattended. Bring another log only when asked. Even tending a fire became part of growing older. Outside, the village was still wrapped in soft morning mist. The fields seemed endless beneath the pale sky. Tiny drops of dew rested on blades of grass, sparkling quietly as sunlight slowly arrived. Spider webs stretched between small branches, each thread decorated with silver droplets that disappeared one by one as the air became warmer. Young people often noticed these small changes without speaking of them. The seasons taught careful observation. Spring mornings carried birdsong that winter had hidden away. Summer filled the air with insects. Autumn painted leaves in quiet shades of gold and brown. Winter softened the world beneath frost. No calendar was needed to understand these changes. Nature offered its own patient reminders. As children entered their early teenage years, adults gradually began treating them differently. The change was subtle. No celebration marked the moment. No one declared that childhood had ended. Instead, expectations quietly shifted. A father might pause before lifting a heavy sack himself. He would look toward his son. Together they carried it. A mother preparing bread might ask her daughter to knead the dough alone while she completed another task nearby. The work was trusted to younger hands. Not perfectly, but willingly. This quiet sharing of responsibility meant something important. Adults were beginning to believe that the young could help carry the weight of ordinary life. Not all at once. Little by little. The village itself became a kind of classroom. Every road taught direction. Every fence marked careful work. Every garden revealed months of patient effort. Young people walked the same path so often that they knew each bend without thinking. They recognized which tree bloomed first each spring. Which corner stayed muddy after rain. Which roof always gathered snow longest during winter. Familiar places slowly became part of memory. Many would spend decades walking these same roads. They did not grow tired of them. The roads changed quietly with every season. Each year offered slightly different colors, different sounds, different scents carried on the wind. The sounds of the village also became deeply familiar. A hammer striking iron. The turning wheel of the mill beside the stream. The gentle creaking of wagon wheels. Children laughing somewhere beyond a garden wall. The steady chopping of wood. The soft ringing of sheep bells from distant hills. These sounds blended together into the quiet music of everyday life. No orchestra performed. No audience gathered. Yet every village possessed its own gentle rhythm. Those who grew up there carried that rhythm within them for the rest of their lives. Even years later, hearing the familiar sound of an axe striking wood could awaken memories of childhood mornings. Memory often travels through sound before it finds words. Young people also began learning the importance of keeping things in good condition. Nothing was easily replaced. A wooden bucket with a loose handle was repaired. A torn cloak received another patch. A cracked stool gained a stronger leg. A broken basket was woven together again. Repair was simply part of life. Children watched adults carefully mend everyday objects until repairing became natural to them as well. This habit shaped more than practical skills. It shaped the way people thought. Things deserved care. Work deserved respect. Time invested in making something should not be wasted. Patience lived inside every repair. The older members of the village often seemed to know everything. At least from the perspective of a child. An elderly shepherd remembered storms from 50 years earlier. A grandmother recognized healing herbs growing beside woodland paths. An old carpenter could judge the strength of timber simply by touching it. These forms of knowledge rarely existed inside books. They lived inside people. Young listeners learned that age carried quiet authority. Not because older people were always right, but because they had witnessed many seasons. Experience itself became a teacher. Sometimes an elder would stop walking for only a moment. They would examine the sky, feel the wind, then quietly say, "Rain before evening." Hours later, clouds gathered exactly as predicted. Young people watched these moments with quiet admiration. Knowledge seemed almost magical, though it had simply been earned through long observation. Respect for age did not mean fear. Many older people were gentle storytellers. Winter evenings especially offered time for conversation. Outside, snow might settle softly upon rooftops. Inside, children gathered near the warmth of the fire. Someone spun wool. Someone carved wood. Hands remained busy while voices carried stories through the room. Some stories explained where nearby hills received their names. Others described unusually harsh winters long ago. Some recalled generous neighbors. Others remembered difficult harvests that eventually ended. Not every story taught a lesson directly. Many simply reminded young listeners that life always moved in seasons. Good years. Hard years. Hopeful years. Quiet years. Nothing remained exactly the same forever. The young gradually learned that every person possessed a place within the larger order of the community. No role appeared too small. The person who cared for chickens mattered. The person who sharpened tools mattered. The woman who baked bread mattered. The man who repaired roofs mattered. The child who gathered kindling also mattered. One task supported another. One family depended upon the next. People often spoke of neighbors by their work. The miller's family. The shepherd's house. The blacksmith's son. Work and identity often stood closely together. Young people naturally imagined themselves becoming part of the same pattern. It felt familiar. Steady. Understandable. Sometimes traveling merchants visited the village. Their arrival gently interrupted the usual rhythm. A wagon appeared along the dusty road. Its wheels carried goods from places most villagers had never seen. Bright cloth. Small metal tools. Fine pottery. Spices with unfamiliar scents. Children watched with wide eyes. The merchants brought more than objects. They carried stories. Stories of distant towns. Large markets. Wide rivers. High mountains. Busy roads filled with strangers. For a short while, the world seemed much larger than the fields surrounding the village. Young imaginations wandered with those tales. Yet after a day or two, the merchants continued onward. The dust settled once more. The village returned to its ordinary pace. Most young people did not feel disappointed. Home still held everything they truly understood. As afternoon sunlight stretched longer across the ground, shadows slowly lengthened beside fences and stone walls. The hardest work of the day usually came to an end. Animals were counted carefully before returning to their shelters. Tools found their familiar places once again. Water buckets stood ready for tomorrow. Children who had spent hours outdoors carried dust upon their shoes and sunlight upon their faces. They were tired. Not from rushing, but from steady effort. There is a peaceful kind of tiredness that follows honest work. Many young people knew that feeling well. It arrived quietly each evening. Not unpleasant. Simply complete. Supper gathered everyone together again. Steam rose gently from bowls placed upon sturdy wooden tables. Bread was broken by hand. Fresh butter softened beside the warmth of the fire. Soup filled the room with comforting aromas of onions, herbs, barley, and slow-cooked vegetables. Conversation remained calm. No one hurried through the meal. Eating itself deserved time. Children listened while adults discussed tomorrow's weather, the condition of crops, the health of neighbors, and the small concerns that shaped ordinary life. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Simply the quiet business of living. Sometimes laughter appeared unexpectedly. A forgotten memory. A child's innocent mistake. A funny story from years ago. The laughter never lasted long. Soon gentle conversation returned once more. When darkness finally settled over the village, candles burned softly inside windows. The stars emerged one after another. Far away, an owl called through the forest. The cool night air carried the scent of damp earth and pine. Families slowly prepared for sleep. Boots were placed neatly beside doors. Clothing hung carefully where it could dry overnight. The fire was arranged so that warm embers might survive until morning. Young people climbed into their simple beds. Their muscles rested after another day of work. Their minds drifted through memories of familiar tasks, familiar faces, familiar voices. Outside, the village became wonderfully quiet. The roads emptied. The animals settled. Only the wind continued moving through fields that would welcome another sunrise before long. And as sleep gently arrived, another small day quietly joined all the days that had come before it. No great event marked its passing. No history book would ever mention it. Yet it was days exactly like these, patient, ordinary, and shared, that slowly shaped what it meant to be young in a world where order was not something people questioned. It was simply the gentle rhythm into which they had been born, and the steady rhythm they would carry with them as they continued to grow. The village did not awaken all at once. It never had. Morning moved gently from one corner of the settlement to another, like light spreading across a quiet pond. First came the faint glow in the eastern sky. Then the birds began their careful conversations among the branches. A rooster answered from somewhere behind a weathered fence. Soon another joined in from farther away, and then another, until the sound drifted across the fields in soft waves. The first doors opened. Cold air slipped inside warm homes. Fresh air carried the scent of damp earth, growing grass, and smoke that had never fully disappeared from the night's fire. Another ordinary day had begun. For the young, ordinary days were never truly empty. Even when each morning seemed much like the last, something small was always changing. A shirt that had once reached almost to the knees now rested slightly higher. Hands had become stronger. Steps had become longer. A task that once seemed difficult now felt almost effortless. Growth often arrived so quietly that only others noticed it. A mother might smile as she watched her son lift a bucket that had been too heavy only the previous year. A father might pause for a moment after seeing his daughter split kindling with steady confidence. Neither child fully understood why the adults smiled. To them, they were simply doing what had to be done. Yet the older eyes in the family noticed these changes with quiet satisfaction. Another season had passed. Another child was slowly becoming an adult. In many villages, the morning meal was simple but comforting. A thick bowl of porridge warmed hands still chilled from the cool air. Fresh bread, baked the day before, was sliced carefully so nothing would be wasted. Sometimes there was butter. Sometimes soft cheese. Sometimes honey if the bees had been generous. A small clay cup might hold watered milk or a warm drink made from herbs gathered nearby. Meals were not hurried. Neither were they especially long. Everyone understood that work was waiting outside. Yet these few peaceful moments together helped begin the day with a feeling of quiet order. Children noticed small routines without thinking about them. Who always sat nearest the fire? Who reached first for the bread knife? Who silently offered the first piece to the oldest member of the household? These customs were rarely explained. They simply lived within the family. After breakfast, each person moved toward familiar responsibilities. One young boy followed his father toward the fields where rows of grain stretched beneath the morning light. Another walked beside an older brother toward the forest, carrying only a small bundle of rope and a hand axe sized for younger hands. A girl joined her mother near the loom, where threads waited patiently to become cloth. Another carried empty baskets toward the garden where vegetables needed gathering before the heat of the afternoon. No one announced these tasks with ceremony. Work was as natural as sunrise. The young understood that every season brought different needs. During planting, the fields called everyone outdoors. During harvest, nearly every pair of hands became valuable. During winter, work often moved closer to the warmth of home. Life followed the land. The land followed the seasons. The seasons followed the sky. Everything seemed connected. The fields themselves became familiar companions. Young people knew which areas dried first after heavy rain. They remembered where wildflowers appeared each spring. They recognized the old oak tree standing alone near the edge of one pasture. Children sometimes rested beneath its wide branches during midday, sharing a piece of bread while listening to bees hum among nearby blossoms. The tree had stood there before they were born. Perhaps it would still stand long after they were gone. Its quiet presence reminded everyone that some parts of the world moved more slowly than human lives. Working beside adults revealed another lesson. Not every task required conversation. A father and son might spend hours repairing a fence with only a few words between them. A mother and daughter could prepare vegetables together while speaking only when necessary. Silence was never uncomfortable. Instead, it allowed attention to remain on careful hands and steady work. The sound of wood fitting against wood. The scrape of a knife through fresh vegetables. The gentle rustle of leaves moving in the breeze. These sounds filled the quiet naturally. No one felt compelled to replace them with endless conversation. Young people grew comfortable inside these peaceful silences. They learned that companionship did not always require speaking. Simply working together could be enough. By the middle of the morning, the village settled fully into its daily rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer echoed from the workshop. The mill wheel turned steadily beside the stream. Geese wandered noisily across open yards. Dogs stretched beneath wagons before falling asleep once more. Children too young for serious work invented games with sticks, stones, and imagination. Older children smiled as they passed but continued toward their own responsibilities. They remembered those games well. Only a few years earlier, they had played them too. Growing older often meant leaving certain pleasures behind without ever deciding to. Life simply carried people forward. Young people quickly discovered that patience was one of the most useful skills anyone could possess. Seeds did not grow because someone wished them to. Bread did not bake faster if watched closely. Wool did not become cloth in a single afternoon. Everything worthy of care required time. Many lessons repeated this truth. A young apprentice carving wood often became frustrated when the knife slipped or the shape refused to match the master's example. The older craftsman rarely scolded. Instead, he might gently turn the piece of wood in his hands. He would study it for a moment. Then smile quietly. Again. Only one word. No anger. No disappointment. Simply another chance. The apprentice began once more. One careful cut. Then another. Months passed. Years passed. Eventually, the same young hands moved with quiet confidence. The lesson had never truly been about wood. It had always been about patience. Weather continued to shape every decision. Clouds drifting across the sky received careful attention. The smell of approaching rain sometimes arrived before the first dark cloud appeared. Experienced adults noticed these changes immediately. Young people slowly learned to notice them as well. The wind shifted direction. Birds became unusually quiet. Cattle gathered closer together. Each sign whispered something about the coming hours. Nature spoke softly. Those who listened carefully rarely felt surprised. Sometimes the day brought visitors. Perhaps a traveler seeking water. Perhaps a cousin from another village. Perhaps an elderly relative arriving slowly with the help of a walking stick polished smooth by many years of use. Visitors were welcomed with simple kindness. A place at the table. Fresh bread. A warm drink. Questions about their journey. News from neighboring communities. Children often sat quietly nearby, pretending not to listen while absorbing every word. The outside world entered the home through conversation. Stories traveled farther than most people ever would. As afternoon approached, Sunlight grew warmer. The shadows beneath trees became welcome places to rest for a short while. Workers paused only briefly. A small piece of cheese. A crust of bread. A drink of cool water drawn from the well. No feast was needed. Simple food tasted especially satisfying after honest work. Young people often noticed how different bread seemed outdoors. Perhaps it was the fresh air. Perhaps the tired muscles. Or perhaps gratitude quietly improved every meal. There were moments when work became almost peaceful enough to resemble meditation. A girl guiding thread through a loom found herself moving with steady rhythm. Back and forth. Back and forth. The wooden frame answered with its soft, familiar sounds. Nearby, her mother worked at the same pace. Neither spoke for several minutes. The rhythm itself seemed to fill the room. Elsewhere, a boy gathered apples one at a time into a woven basket. Each apple turned gently in his hand before finding its place among the others. The basket slowly grew heavier. The branches slowly grew lighter. Nothing dramatic happened. Yet there was quiet satisfaction in watching simple work reach completion. Toward evening, the color of the world slowly changed. The bright light of afternoon softened into gentle shades of gold. Long shadows stretched across gardens and fields. Birdsong shifted once more as flocks settled into nearby trees. The air cooled pleasantly. Children returning from distant pastures greeted familiar neighbors along the road. A shepherd counted every sheep carefully before closing the gate. 1, 2, 3. The numbers came almost without thought. Carefulness mattered. Even a single missing animal would be noticed. Responsibility often revealed itself in such quiet moments. Inside the homes, supper preparations began once again. The fire welcomed another pot. Steam rose slowly toward dark wooden beams overhead. Fresh herbs added gentle fragrance to the room. Someone needed another loaf for tomorrow. Someone else repaired a torn sleeve while waiting for the meal to finish. Hands rarely remained idle for long. Not because rest was forbidden, but because there was always some small task that could make tomorrow a little easier. Children watched these habits every evening. Without realizing it, they slowly adopted them. Care today made tomorrow gentler. As darkness settled over the village, windows glowed softly with candlelight. Families gathered close together. Outside, the wind moved quietly through tall grass. Inside, conversation drifted from one simple subject to another. Someone remembered a neighbor's wedding many years before. Someone wondered whether the coming winter would be cold. Someone laughed gently at a story from childhood. Young listeners absorbed these memories as naturally as breathing. One day, they too would tell these stories. Perhaps to children sitting beside another fire. Perhaps in the very same home. Perhaps beneath the same old roof. The thought never needed to be spoken. It simply belonged to the quiet order of life. The flames danced softly. The voices gradually became fewer. One by one, family members prepared for sleep. Outside, the stars shone with the same patient light that had watched over countless generations before them. Tomorrow would arrive gently. The work would continue. The seasons would continue. The young would grow a little older. And another quiet day would become part of the long, peaceful story of a life shaped not by sudden change, but by steady rhythms that asked only for patience, care, and time. The days were easy to count, but the years often slipped by unnoticed. A child might wake one spring morning believing the world looked exactly as it had the year before. The same path led from the doorway to the well. The same willow leaned over the stream. The same hen scratched patiently beside the fence, searching for seeds hidden beneath the soil. Everything seemed unchanged. And yet, almost without anyone realizing it, the child had grown taller. Their footsteps had become steadier. Their shoulders had become stronger. The bucket they once dragged across the yard could now be carried with quiet confidence. This was how growing up often happened in a world of order. Not through dramatic moments. Not through grand announcements. But through hundreds of ordinary mornings that quietly gathered together until one day everyone realized the child was no longer quite a child. The older members of the village noticed these changes first. An elderly neighbor might smile as a young boy walked past carrying an armful of firewood. "I remember when those logs were too heavy for you." The boy might smile politely, almost embarrassed. He had not noticed the difference himself. Growth is often invisible from the inside. Others see it before we do. Parents especially understood this quiet mystery. They watched children every single day. Because the changes were so gradual, they almost disappeared into the routine of life. Then, perhaps while hanging freshly washed clothes to dry, a mother suddenly paused. Her daughter's dress looked shorter than it had only a few months earlier. Not because the cloth had changed. Because the girl had grown. Small moments like these quietly reminded families that time never truly stood still. Morning chores continued to shape each day. Some tasks never changed. The chickens still needed feeding. The fire still needed tending. Water still had to be carried. The animals still depended upon patient hands. These responsibilities returned each sunrise with remarkable faithfulness. For young people, repetition was not considered dull. It was simply part of life. There was comfort in knowing what the morning would ask. The hands often remembered the work before the mind fully awakened. A wooden pail fit naturally against the hip. A familiar path required little thought. Even the gate latch opened with a movement practiced hundreds of times before. Routine quietly became second nature. Sometimes the weather offered gentle surprises. A light fog settled over the fields, making familiar places appear mysterious for a little while. The church tower emerged slowly through the mist. Trees became dark shapes waiting in silence. The nearby stream could be heard before it could be seen. Young people often enjoyed these mornings. The village felt both familiar and new at the same time. As the sun climbed higher, the mist slowly disappeared. The ordinary world returned. But for a little while, it had reminded everyone that even familiar places could still feel magical. Learning never truly stopped. Even older teenagers continued watching experienced adults with careful attention. Knowledge was too valuable to assume. A shepherd still listened when an elder spoke about changing weather. A young weaver still watched an older woman's hands moving smoothly across the loom. A carpenter's apprentice still studied the quiet patience of the master before making each careful cut. The greatest teachers rarely hurried. Their confidence had been shaped by many seasons. They understood that true skill could not be forced. One lesson today. Another tomorrow. Years later, those small lessons would join together almost without notice. The forests surrounding many villages held a special place in young minds. They were familiar enough to feel safe, yet mysterious enough to inspire quiet curiosity. Children were warned not to wander too deeply alone. Not because the woods were evil. Because forests demanded respect. Old trees could hide unexpected hollows. Streams changed after heavy rain. Paths sometimes disappeared beneath fallen leaves. Those who entered the woods learned to pay attention. A broken branch. Fresh animal tracks. the direction of sunlight through the trees, the sound of flowing water. Observation became another quiet companion. Collecting firewood often brought young people into these peaceful forests. The work itself was simple. Gather fallen branches. Choose dry wood rather than damp. Tie the bundle carefully with rope. Carry only what could be managed safely. While working, the forest offered many small gifts. Birdsong echoed between tall trunks. Squirrels hurried along branches overhead. Soft moss covered old stones. The scent of pine mixed gently with cool earth. There was no need to rush. The forest seemed to encourage slower breathing. Even children naturally lowered their voices beneath its quiet canopy. Returning home with a bundle of wood often brought quiet satisfaction. The load might not appear impressive to an adult. Yet each trip mattered. Each bundle would help warm the family during colder evenings. Young people slowly discovered something important. Small efforts added together became something meaningful. One armful of wood. One loaf of bread. One repaired fence. One bucket of water. None seemed remarkable alone. Together they made daily life possible. This understanding shaped many lives long before anyone put it into words. At midday, the village settled into a peaceful rhythm once again. The brightest sunlight rested upon rooftops. Cats stretched lazily beside warm stone walls. The mill continued turning beside the stream, its steady sound blending with flowing water. Some workers paused briefly beneath shade. Others continued, knowing clouds might arrive later. Young people learned another lesson during these quiet hours. Nature never followed human wishes. If rain came unexpectedly, work changed. If sunshine lasted longer than expected, opportunities appeared. Flexibility mattered. The land always had the final word. Many villages celebrated the changing seasons with simple gatherings. These were not grand spectacles. They were opportunities for neighbors to share food, songs, and quiet happiness after long weeks of work. For the young, such gatherings carried special meaning. They saw relatives from nearby villages. They heard musicians playing familiar melodies. Children who had grown taller since the last gathering greeted one another with shy smiles. Parents exchanged news. Grandparents remembered celebrations from decades before. Time seemed to fold gently upon itself. The oldest and youngest generations shared the same open space beneath the same evening sky. Music rarely belonged only to trained performers. Simple songs traveled easily from one generation to another. A melody sung while planting grain. Another hummed while spinning wool. One remembered during harvest. Another whispered softly to restless children before sleep. Young people learned these songs naturally. No lessons were scheduled. The melodies simply became part of everyday life. Years later, many adults found themselves quietly humming the same tunes while working alone. Memory often returned through music before it returned through words. As adolescence slowly unfolded, young people also became more aware of the expectations surrounding them. Not harsh expectations. Steady ones. Be dependable. Speak honestly. Keep your promises. Care for your family. Treat neighbors with respect. Protect what has been entrusted to you. These ideas appeared again and again through everyday actions rather than speeches. A father returning borrowed tools in good condition. A mother sending bread to an elderly neighbor. An older brother helping repair another family's roof after a storm. Children watched. They remembered. Character was often learned through quiet example. Evening arrived almost unnoticed. The golden light slowly softened into amber. The air cooled. Swallows dipped gracefully across the sky, catching insects before darkness settled completely. Smoke rose once more from countless chimneys. The familiar smell drifted gently across the village. Home called everyone back. Inside, supper waited. Perhaps vegetable stew with fresh herbs. Perhaps thick slices of bread beside soft cheese. Perhaps dried apples saved carefully from the previous autumn. The meal was simple. It did not need to be elaborate. Hunger, honest work, and family made ordinary food feel generous. After supper, there was often a little time before sleep. Not enough for another large task. Just enough for smaller ones. A father sharpened a knife with slow, steady strokes. A mother folded freshly woven cloth. A grandmother repaired worn socks beside the fire. An older brother carved a simple wooden spoon. A younger sister carefully untangled yarn for tomorrow's weaving. The room remained peaceful. Each person occupied with gentle work. Occasionally someone spoke. Then silence returned naturally. No one felt the need to chase it away. The fire crackled softly. Its warm light danced across wooden walls polished by many years of smoke and careful hands. Before bed, some children stepped outside for one final moment. The village looked completely different beneath the stars. The road seemed quieter. The fields stretched into darkness. The sky felt endless. Without bright lights to hide them, countless stars filled the heavens. Young people often learn the familiar constellations from older relatives. Not through books. By standing together beneath the night sky. One finger pointed upward. That one returns every winter. Follow those stars, and you will find the north. The heavens became another kind of map. Another teacher. Another reminder that the world was both vast and wonderfully ordered. Soon, doors closed gently. Candles were extinguished one by one. The fire settled into glowing embers prepared carefully for tomorrow morning. Families climbed beneath warm blankets. Outside, the wind continued its quiet journey across fields and forests. The old willow beside the stream swayed gently in the darkness. The animals rested. The village slept. Another peaceful day had joined the countless ordinary days that shaped a lifetime. No one would remember this particular date. No songs would celebrate it. No books would record it. Yet it mattered deeply. Because lives are not built only from remarkable moments. They are built from mornings that begin with familiar light. From work shared with steady hands. From meals eaten together. From stories told beside a patient fire. From evenings that end beneath quiet stars. And for a young person growing within a world where order gently guided each passing season, these ordinary days became the foundation upon which an entire life would slowly, peacefully, and almost invisibly be built. Before the village was fully awake, the world already seemed quietly alive. A thin layer of mist rested across the fields, softening every fence, every tree, and every distant hill. Dew clung to the long grass, each drop catching the first pale light of dawn. Somewhere beyond the houses, a stream continued its endless journey over smooth stones, sounding exactly as it had yesterday, and the day before that, and perhaps for generations before anyone living had been born. The village did not need an alarm to greet the morning. The earth itself offered enough gentle reminders. Birds greeted the sunrise before people did. The cool air carried the smell of damp soil and wood smoke. A single rooster called from one yard, answered by another farther away. Then came the soft creak of a door opening. Another ordinary day had quietly begun. As young people grew, they learned something that no one ever wrote down. Every season asks something different of them. Spring invited careful hope. Summer asked for endurance. Autumn rewarded patience. Winter encouraged stillness. These lessons were never spoken as rules. They simply appeared through experience. A child who planted seeds in spring had to wait many weeks before seeing the reward. No amount of wishing could hurry the green shoots from the earth. The land taught patience far more gently than words ever could. Spring was perhaps the busiest season for hope. Fields that had rested beneath frost now waited for careful hands. The soil felt cool and dark after winter. Adults walked slowly across the land, studying its condition before beginning their work. Young people followed close behind. Some carried baskets filled with seed. Others held simple wooden tools polished smooth by years of use. There was a quiet rhythm to planting. One step. One handful. Another step. Another handful. The work continued without hurry. Each seed disappeared beneath the earth with almost no sound at all. Looking across the freshly planted field, very little seemed different. Yet everyone understood that something important had begun. Much of life required believing in things that could not yet be seen. The youngest children often asked when the grain would appear. The answer was always gentle. Soon. Soon might mean many days. It might mean weeks. Children slowly learned that nature used a different measure of time. The sun rose one day at a time. Rain arrived when it wished. Roots stretched quietly beneath the soil, invisible to everyone above. Even while nothing appeared to happen, the earth was patiently working. This quiet truth stayed with many young people throughout their lives. Not every important change could be seen immediately. Summer brought longer days. The sun climbed high into clear blue skies. Morning work often began earlier to avoid the strongest heat. Young people became familiar with the feeling of warm earth beneath their feet and sunlight upon their shoulders. Fields shimmered gently in the distance. Wildflowers filled the edges of narrow paths. Bees traveled from blossom to blossom with remarkable determination. Everything seemed quietly busy. Nature asked every living thing to make good use of the season. Children learned to recognize the different sounds of summer. Grasshoppers sang from tall grass. Swallows circled gracefully overhead. Leaves whispered softly whenever a breeze wandered through the trees. Far away, the steady knocking of a woodpecker echoed through the forest. These sounds became so familiar that silence would have seemed stranger than noise. Years later, many adults remembered childhood summers not through pictures, but through these gentle voices of the land. Summer also meant caring for growing things. Gardens needed weeding. Animals needed fresh water more often. Fruit trees required attention. Nothing could simply be left alone. Young people discovered that living things responded kindly to regular care. Plants flourished when weeds were removed. Animals remained healthy when watched carefully. The land rewarded patience more often than speed. Not every lesson came from success. Sometimes mistakes became valuable teachers. A young boy might accidentally leave a gate unlatched. A curious goat wandered into the vegetable garden. Several neat rows of cabbage disappeared before anyone noticed. The adults sighed. The vegetables could not be restored. The boy felt deeply embarrassed. No long punishment followed. Instead, his father quietly repaired the broken fence while the boy carefully helped. Nothing more needed to be said. The lesson stayed far longer than harsh words ever would have. Responsibility often grew strongest after honest mistakes. Young girls and boys alike became more trusted with independent work as they grew older. Perhaps an older sister carried bread to a neighboring farm by herself for the first time. Perhaps a young shepherd spent an afternoon watching the flock without constant supervision. These moments felt quietly important. No ceremony marked them. No one announced that childhood had ended. Trust simply expanded a little. Like daylight slowly spreading across the morning sky. The roads between villages were familiar to many young people. They were not wide. Often they were little more than well-worn paths shaped by countless footsteps and wagon wheels. Along these paths grew wildflowers in spring and tall grasses in summer. Small streams crossed beneath simple wooden bridges. Old trees offered shade to travelers during warm afternoons. Walking these roads taught observation. One learned where blackberries ripened first. Which bridge became slippery after rain. Which bend offered the finest view across the valley. The journey itself became familiar enough to feel almost like another home. Autumn arrived slowly. At first, only a few leaves changed color. Then entire trees dressed themselves in gold, amber, and deep red. The mornings grew cooler. Mist lingered longer across open fields. The scent of ripe apples drifted from orchards. Harvest season called everyone outdoors. The work was steady. There was grain to gather, fruit to store, vegetables to preserve before winter arrived. Young people often worked beside adults from sunrise until evening. The days were long. The baskets grew heavy. Yet there was satisfaction in watching barns slowly fill. Every bundle stored away promised greater comfort during the colder months ahead. Harvest also reminded young people that many months of quiet effort had finally reached their purpose. The tiny seeds planted in spring had become fields of grain. The blossoms had become fruit. The careful work of countless ordinary mornings now rested safely inside barns and storage rooms. Nothing about the harvest felt sudden. It had been growing little by little every day. Just as children themselves were growing. As evenings became cooler, life gradually shifted indoors. The fire once again became the heart of the home. Families gathered close together after supper. Outside, the wind carried fallen leaves across empty paths. Inside, the room glowed with warm light. Someone spun wool. Someone carved wood. Someone repaired worn boots before winter arrived. Young people often listened while older relatives shared memories of harvests from long ago. Some had been abundant. Others had been difficult. Yet each story ended with the same quiet understanding. The seasons always continued. Winter never lasted forever. Spring always returned. Winter itself transformed the village. Snow covered familiar roads until they almost disappeared. The fields rested beneath soft white blankets. The forests became wonderfully still. Even sounds seemed quieter after fresh snowfall. Young people discovered that winter possessed its own gentle rhythm. Outdoor work became shorter. Indoor work became more important. Tools needed repairing. Clothing needed mending. Firewood disappeared steadily from carefully stacked piles. Families spent more hours together than during any other season. Conversation naturally grew longer. Stories returned once more. Children listened with quiet attention as flames danced across the room. During long winter evenings, grandparents often became the keepers of memory. They spoke slowly, never rushing. Perhaps they remembered the first winter after their own marriage. Perhaps they recalled unusual storms or especially gentle summers. The young listened not because every story was exciting. Many were wonderfully ordinary. And that was precisely why they mattered. Ordinary lives deserved remembering too. Before sleep, children sometimes looked through the small window beside their beds. The moon rested above snowy rooftops. Stars sparkled with remarkable brightness in the cold sky. Everything outside appeared peaceful. The village seemed to breathe slowly beneath its blanket of winter silence. Inside, the fire had become glowing embers once again. Warm blankets waited. Tomorrow would bring another familiar day. Perhaps more snow. Perhaps clear skies. Perhaps another small lesson hidden inside an ordinary chore. No one knew exactly. But everyone trusted the seasons to continue as they always had. And so another day quietly came to its end. Another page in a life that no history book would record. Another peaceful chapter in the childhood of countless young people whose greatest adventures were often found in careful work, changing seasons, shared meals, gentle stories, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow's sunrise would once again find the village ready to begin anew. When winter settled over the village, it did not arrive all at once. The first signs were easy to miss. One morning, the grass sparkled with a thin layer of frost that disappeared soon after sunrise. A few days later, the pond near the edge of the meadow wore a skin of ice so delicate that it cracked beneath the weight of a curious bird. The wind carried a sharper feeling, encouraging everyone to pull their cloaks a little closer around their shoulders. Young people noticed these small changes because they lived so closely with the land. There was no separation between daily life and the seasons. The earth quietly shaped every ordinary moment. Inside each home, preparations for the colder months had begun long before the first snowfall. Bundles of dried herbs hung from wooden beams above the hearth. Strings of onions rested against cool walls. Barrels held grain gathered during autumn. Clay jars contained preserved vegetables. Apples slept beneath layers of straw in cool storage rooms. Firewood, stacked carefully through the warmer months, now stood beside the house in neat rows. Every piece of wood represented an afternoon spent working beneath summer skies. Nothing had been gathered without purpose. Young people understood this more clearly with each passing year. The warmth of winter had truly begun during the heat of summer. One morning, snow finally arrived. Not in a great storm. Just a few quiet flakes drifting gently from a sky the color of soft wool. Children often paused in the middle of their chores to watch. The flakes floated slowly, turning as they fell. Some landed on wooden fences. Others rested on bare branches. Soon, rooftops began to whiten. The paths through the village softened beneath a thin blanket of fresh snow. The entire world seemed quieter. Snow possessed a remarkable gift. It gently hushed familiar sounds. Footsteps became softer. Wagon wheels moved more quietly. Even distant voices seemed wrapped in calm. For the youngest children, the first snowfall always carried a quiet sense of wonder. For older children and teenagers, it carried responsibility as well. Paths needed clearing. Water had to be brought carefully before the well became difficult to reach. Animals required extra bedding. The fire demanded more attention than before. Winter offered beauty. It also asked for careful preparation. Morning chores now began beside the fire. Before anyone stepped into the cold air, another log was placed upon the glowing embers. The room slowly warmed. Hands stretched toward the flames. Boots dried near the hearth from yesterday's snow. The smell of burning oak and pine filled the home with quiet comfort. Young people often remembered this warmth for the rest of their lives. Years later, the scent of wood smoke could carry them gently back to childhood mornings. Back to familiar voices. Back to the steady rhythm of family life. Outside, the village moved more slowly than during summer. No one hurried across icy paths. Each step was placed carefully. The old horse pulling the supply wagon lowered its head as it walked, finding secure footing beneath the snow. Children learned to move with patience. Winter rewarded careful feet. Rushing often led to slipping. Nature quietly encouraged a slower pace. Many outdoor tasks became shorter during the coldest weeks. Instead, much of life moved indoors. Homes became workshops filled with steady hands. The sound of spinning wheels returned each afternoon. Wooden looms quietly clicked back and forth. Knives gently shaped spoons, bowls, and tool handles from carefully dried wood. Leather was softened, stitched, and repaired. Warm clothing received fresh patches before older ones wore through completely. The young worked beside the old. Learning continued even while snow covered the fields. Winter evenings often seemed longer than the clock could measure. Darkness arrived early. Candles burned softly. The fire became the brightest light in the room. Outside, the wind wandered through bare branches. Inside, conversation drifted gently from one memory to another. Grandparents often spoke more during these evenings. Not because they had suddenly become more talkative. Simply because winter created space for remembering. There was less daylight for outdoor labor. More time remained for stories. A grandfather might describe the winter when the river froze so deeply that wagons crossed upon the ice. A grandmother might remember learning to weave beside her own mother many decades before. The stories were not dramatic. They unfolded slowly. Like the seasons themselves. Young listeners learned that history did not belong only to kings or battles. History also lived inside ordinary families. Inside quiet kitchens. Inside weathered hands. Inside memories shared beside the fire. The young also discovered that winter required cooperation. One person carried wood. Another prepared supper. Someone repaired tools. Someone watched younger children while older family members completed necessary work. No single task seemed especially important by itself. Together, however, they created comfort. Warm meals appeared because many small jobs had been completed first. A hot bowl of soup represented countless earlier efforts. Someone had planted vegetables. Someone had harvested them. Someone had preserved them. Someone had carried water. Someone had tended the fire. Young people slowly understood that comfort was rarely accidental. It was carefully built. On especially cold mornings, windows sometimes bloomed with delicate patterns of frost. Tiny crystals spread across the glass like quiet forests made of ice. Children often paused to admire them before wiping away a small circle to look outside. The world beyond seemed peaceful. Smoke rose straight upward into still air. Snow rested upon fences, rooftops, and tree branches without moving. Even the animals appeared quieter. The village looked as though it had taken a deep breath and decided to remain wonderfully still. When the weather allowed, young people still ventured outdoors. Firewood never gathered itself. Animals still needed care. The chickens waited for grain. The sheep required fresh hay. The stable needed cleaning. Work continued. Only its rhythm had changed. Heavy summer labor gave way to careful winter routines. Every season asked different things from growing hands. Children often became surprisingly skilled at reading winter weather. They noticed how snow sounded beneath their boots. Fresh snow whispered softly. Older snow sometimes squeaked in the cold. Ice beneath a thin layer of powder demanded extra caution. The wind carried messages as well. A gentle breeze promised little trouble. A stronger one hinted that more snow might soon arrive. Observation became almost instinctive. The land quietly trained those who lived close to it. Sometimes travelers appeared unexpectedly during winter. A knock sounded at the door while darkness still covered the fields. The family welcomed the visitor inside. A place near the fire was offered without hesitation. Wet gloves were dried. Warm soup was shared. Questions about the journey waited until the traveler had rested. Hospitality carried special importance during cold weather. Everyone understood how difficult winter roads could become. Young people watched these acts of kindness carefully. They learned that generosity often appeared most naturally when life became difficult. As weeks passed, children noticed another quiet miracle. The days slowly began growing longer again. At first, the change was almost impossible to see. The evening light lingered for only a few extra moments. Then another. Then another. No announcement marked the turning of the season. The earth simply continued its patient journey. Young people learned to trust these small changes. Even the longest winter slowly moved toward spring. One afternoon, while gathering kindling near the edge of the forest, a young boy heard a familiar sound. Water. The stream beneath its layer of ice had begun flowing more freely again. Nearby, tiny drops fell from the branches where sunlight warmed yesterday's snow. Drip. 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 The sound was quiet. Yet it carried hope. Winter had not ended. But change had already begun. Nature often worked long before anyone noticed. Back in the village, life continued as it always had. The fire glowed warmly. Bread baked slowly inside the oven. Someone mended a worn sleeve. Someone sharpened a blade until it caught the light. Children listened while older voices spoke softly about tomorrow's work. Outside, evening settled gently across the snowy fields. The first stars appeared above the silent rooftops. One by one, candles were extinguished. Blankets were pulled close. The embers settled into their familiar orange glow. Another peaceful winter day quietly joined all the others. It would never become famous. It would never be written into the records of great kingdoms. Yet it mattered. Because it was within days like these steady, gentle, and shared that young people slowly learned patience, responsibility, kindness, and quiet confidence. These lessons did not arrive through speeches. They came through warm fires after cold mornings. Through shared work. Through familiar voices. Through snow that covered the village with silence before giving way, little by little, to the promise of another spring. By the time the first signs of spring returned, the village had almost forgotten the many shades of green. For months, the fields had rested beneath frost and snow. The trees had stood quietly with bare branches reaching into pale winter skies. The gardens had waited beneath cold earth, holding their secrets in silence. Then, almost too gently to notice, the world began changing again. A patch of snow disappeared from the sunny side of a stone wall. Water trickled beneath melting ice. The air carried the faint scent of damp soil instead of frozen ground. A robin appeared on a fence post, tilting its head as though inspecting the village after a long absence. No bell announced the arrival of spring. Nature preferred quieter ways of speaking. Young people often noticed these first changes before they fully understood them. The mornings no longer felt quite as cold. The fire burned a little less each evening. The sun remained in the sky just a little longer. The village breathed differently. Doors stayed open for longer moments. Children lingered outside after finishing their chores. Dogs stretched happily in warm patches of sunlight. Even the old cat sleeping beside the hearth chose the doorstep instead. Life slowly drifted outdoors once again. The returning warmth brought familiar work. Winter had been a season of repair. Spring became a season of beginning. Tools carefully stored away were carried back into the daylight. Their wooden handles had been polished by years of steady hands. Iron blades caught the sunlight after being sharpened during long winter evenings. Young people helped carry them to the fields, feeling quietly proud to be trusted with objects that had once seemed far too important for children. Every tool held a story. A shovel might have belonged to a grandfather before passing to a father. A wooden rake could bear smooth marks where countless hands had gripped it over many decades. Nothing was new. Everything had been cared for. That, too, was part of the order of the world. The earth itself seemed ready to awaken. Farmers knelt to crumble handfuls of soil between their fingers. They studied its color, its moisture, its warmth. Young people watched closely. The soil spoke without words. Too wet, and planting must wait. Too dry, and the seeds would struggle. Experience lived in these quiet observations. Older hands understood what younger eyes were only beginning to notice. One morning, the first plowing began. A horse moved slowly across the field. Behind it, a farmer guided the plow with calm, practiced movements. The earth rolled gently aside, revealing darker soil beneath. A young boy walked behind, picking away small stones that might interfere with later planting. The work required attention more than strength. Every stone removed now would make the harvest easier months later. The boy did not complain. He had watched his father do the same work years before. One day, another child might walk behind him. So the rhythm continued. Generation after generation. Elsewhere in the village, young girls helped prepare the gardens. Last year's dried plants were cleared away. Fresh compost was spread carefully. Seeds were counted with surprising care. Each tiny seed carried quiet importance. It was easy to overlook something so small. Yet everyone understood that entire meals depended upon these tiny beginnings. A grandmother smiled as her granddaughter examined a handful of bean seeds. "So much life," she whispered softly. The girl nodded. She did not fully understand. Not yet. But she remembered the words. Years later, while planting with children of her own, she would quietly repeat them. Birds returned in greater numbers each week. Swallows circled above barns. Blackbirds searched freshly turned fields for insects. Geese called from high overhead as they continued their long journeys. Young people recognized many of these sounds before they recognized the birds themselves. Spring had its own music. It was lighter than winter, busier than autumn. Hope seemed to flutter through the air on feathered wings. Children who had spent much of winter indoors now found endless reasons to remain outside. There were fences to repair, branches to gather, garden beds to prepare. Yet even work felt different beneath the warm spring sun. The air smelled alive. Wildflowers began appearing beside familiar paths. The stream ran fuller than before, carrying melted snow toward distant rivers. Sometimes children paused only for a moment to watch tiny leaves unfolding upon old branches. Every year the same miracle returned. Every year it still felt quietly surprising. As spring advanced, lambs appeared in the fields. Soft white wool. Unsteady legs. Curious eyes. Young shepherds watched them with careful attention. New animals required extra care. A lamb separated from its mother needed gentle guidance. A weak one received special attention. Patience mattered. Rushing frightened animals more than it helped them. Children learned to move calmly. Soft voices often achieved more than loud ones. This lesson reached beyond shepherding. Many remembered it throughout life. The village itself slowly became brighter. Freshly washed blankets fluttered in the breeze. Doors remained open while homes were swept clean after the long winter. Sunlight entered rooms that had seemed dim for many months. Dust danced quietly through beams of golden light. Even the smell inside homes changed. The heavy scent of constant fires gave way to fresh air, clean wood, and early blossoms drifting through open windows. The older people often spoke about spring with quiet gratitude. Not because winter had been terrible. Winter had its own beauty. But spring reminded everyone that the world continued faithfully. No matter how long the cold had lasted, green always returned. This dependable cycle comforted people. Young listeners absorbed that comfort without fully realizing it. The seasons quietly taught hope. One afternoon, a young apprentice accompanied the village carpenter into the nearby forest. They were searching for suitable timber. The carpenter moved slowly among the trees. He did not choose the tallest, nor the widest. Instead, he studied each trunk carefully. His fingers rested against the bark. His eyes followed the grain as far as he could see. The apprentice wondered why the choice required so much time. Finally, the older man smiled. A tree grows for many years before becoming useful. He rested one hand against the trunk. We should choose wisely. The apprentice nodded. The lesson reached deeper than trees. Good decisions rarely came from haste. As evening approached, the village settled into familiar calm. The fields glowed beneath the lowering sun. Freshly turned earth reflected warm shades of brown and gold. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. The smell of baking bread drifted through the cool air. Young people returned home with muddy boots and tired legs. Their hands carried the scent of soil. No one minded. The smell meant that spring work had truly begun. After supper, families gathered outside for a little while before darkness fully arrived. The evenings were pleasant now. Children sat upon wooden steps. Parents spoke quietly about tomorrow's tasks. Grandparents watched the sky change color. Above them, swallows made their final graceful circles before settling for the night. The stars appeared one by one. The first frogs began calling from nearby ponds. The air remained cool but gentle. No one hurried indoors. After months of winter evenings spent beside the fire, simply sitting beneath the open sky felt like a quiet celebration. Eventually, candles were lit inside the homes. Doors closed softly. The village grew peaceful once more. Young people climbed into bed carrying the pleasant weariness that follows a full day outdoors. Their hands ached just enough to remind them of honest work. Their minds wandered through simple memories. Fresh earth. Birdsong. Warm sunlight. The laughter of younger children chasing one another between gardens. The steady voice of a parent offering quiet guidance. Outside, the moon rose above fields that had only begun their journey toward another harvest. Beneath the soil, unseen roots were already reaching downward. Above the ground, young people were doing something very similar. They were growing in ways almost invisible from one day to the next. One lesson. One season. One ordinary morning at a time. And just like the seeds resting quietly beneath the spring earth, their future was already beginning to take shape, long before anyone could clearly see what they would one day become. The days slowly grew longer. No one in the village needed to count them. The sunlight itself measured the passing weeks. Morning arrived a little earlier than before, and evening lingered a little longer across the fields. The change was so gentle that it could easily be missed, yet every living thing seemed to notice. Birds greeted the dawn before the first door opened. Flowers turned quietly toward the light. The sheep wandered farther into the hills where fresh grass had become thick and sweet. The young noticed these changes not because someone pointed them out, but because they lived among them every day. The land was not something distant. It was a companion. For many young people, one of the greatest signs of growing older was being trusted to spend more time beyond the village. Not to leave forever. Only to walk a little farther than before. Perhaps they accompanied older siblings into the forest to gather fallen branches. Perhaps they followed a shepherd into the hills. Perhaps they carried supplies to a neighboring farm across the valley. These journeys were not adventures in the way stories often describe them. They were ordinary errands. Yet to someone who had spent most of childhood close to home, they quietly expanded the world. A familiar hill suddenly revealed another meadow beyond it. A narrow path curved toward a stream they had never crossed before. A distant farmhouse, once only a tiny shape on the horizon, became a real place with real people. The world seemed larger. But it also remained wonderfully connected. Walking became part of daily life. Roads were measured not in miles but in time. It is an hour to the mill. Half a morning to the next village. Not much farther now. Young feet grew strong without anyone speaking about exercise. Strength simply arrived through regular movement. Paths climbed gentle hills. Crossed wooden bridges. Wound through forests where sunlight filtered softly between branches. Every journey carried its own quiet rhythm. Sometimes people talked. Sometimes they walked in peaceful silence. The sound of footsteps upon packed earth often seemed enough. Young people quickly learned that every path had its own character. One road became muddy after heavy rain. Another remained dry because it rested upon higher ground. One woodland trail stayed cool even during summer afternoons. Another passed through open meadows filled with wildflowers and butterflies. These details settled into memory. Not because they were important enough to write down. Because they became part of everyday experience. Years later, someone could still remember the scent of pine beside a certain bend in the road. Or the old stone where travelers often paused to rest. Places became familiar through repetition. The hills surrounding many villages offered wide views of the countryside. A young shepherd sitting quietly while the flock grazed might spend long hours simply watching. Fields spread across the valley in neat patterns. Thin trails of smoke rose from distant homes. A river reflected the afternoon sunlight like a ribbon of silver. Cloud shadows drifted slowly across the land. Nothing seemed hurried. The shepherd learned that watching was not the same as doing nothing. Careful observation protected the flock. It also invited quiet thought. Many young people became comfortable with long moments alone. Not lonely. Simply peaceful. While watching the sheep, small discoveries filled the day. A hawk circling high above. Wild rabbits disappearing into tall grass. Tiny flowers growing between stones. The changing shape of clouds. These moments were not distractions. They became part of living closely with the natural world. Children learned that beauty often appeared unexpectedly. Not arranged. Not planned. Simply waiting to be noticed. At home, different lessons continued. Young girls watched bread rise beneath clean cloths. They learned that dough responded differently on cool mornings than on warm afternoons. Too much flour made bread heavy. Too little left it sticky. Hands gradually learned what eyes alone could not judge. Experience lived in touch as much as sight. The older women rarely measured ingredients exactly. Instead, they smiled gently. "You'll know." At first, those words seemed mysterious. Later, they became perfectly clear. Knowledge slowly settled into the hands. Young boys learning woodworking discovered something similar. Every piece of timber behaved differently. Oak resisted the knife. Pine yielded more easily. Fresh wood smelled sweeter than old. A careful craftsperson listened to the sound of the blade as much as they watched it. The wood quietly answered every movement. Patience again revealed itself as the finest tool. Not every lesson came from parents. Neighbors also became teachers. An elderly beekeeper explained why bees preferred certain flowers. A shepherd showed children how to recognize fresh animal tracks after rain. The village healer identified herbs growing unnoticed beside the path. Knowledge belonged to the community. It passed naturally from one person to another. Young people often learned without realizing that they were being taught. Conversation itself carried education. The village well remained one of the busiest places each day. Buckets rose and fell with steady rhythm. Water splashed gently against wooden sides. Neighbors exchanged greetings while waiting their turn. Children often accompanied older family members there. At first, they carried only small containers. As the years passed, the buckets grew larger. One day, almost without noticing, they carried the same heavy pails as the adults. The walk home remained the same. Only the strength of the hands had changed. Water itself inspired respect. Every drop required effort. Someone had to draw it. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to warm it over the fire. Nothing appeared simply by turning a handle. Young people naturally learned not to waste it. A spilled bucket meant another journey to the well. Carefulness became a habit rather than a rule. By midday, the warmth of the sun encouraged brief moments of rest. Workers gathered beneath familiar trees. Bread emerged from cloth bundles. Cheese was sliced. Fresh onions or apples might be shared among family members. Water tasted especially refreshing after hours spent outdoors. Conversation remained simple. The weather. The condition of the crops. A neighbor's new calf. The arrival of migrating birds. Ordinary topics filled ordinary afternoons. No one searched for excitement. The quiet rhythm of life already offered enough. Children sometimes watched insects during these peaceful pauses. Ants carrying crumbs much larger than themselves. Bees disappearing into blossoms before emerging dusted with pollen. Dragonflies hovering above ponds. The smallest creatures quietly demonstrated remarkable determination. Without anyone saying so, young minds absorbed another lesson. Every living thing had its work. Every creature followed its own place within the larger order of the world. As the afternoon light softened, work gradually slowed. Not because every task had been finished. There was always more to do. Instead, people understood the value of ending before exhaustion overcame care. Tools cleaned at the end of the day lasted longer. Animals fed before darkness rested more peacefully. Gardens watered during the evening held moisture more effectively. Experience had quietly shaped these habits over generations. Young people simply stepped into rhythms that already existed. Returning home always carried a comforting familiarity. The same gate. The same stone beside the path. The same dog rising to greet familiar footsteps. Smoke drifting from the chimney. The smell of supper waiting inside. No matter how far someone had walked that day, home gathered everything back together. The walls held memories. The table welcomed every family member. The fire offered warmth without asking where anyone had been. That evening, after the meal had ended, the youngest children had already fallen asleep. The older ones remained beside the fading fire. Outside, crickets had begun their quiet songs. The window stood slightly open, allowing cool evening air to enter the room. An old grandfather slowly polished a wooden walking stick with a piece of cloth. His hands moved with patient certainty. One of the older grandchildren watched quietly. Finally, the child asked why he still polished a stick that already looked smooth. The old man smiled. Because tomorrow it should be ready. The answer seemed almost too simple. Yet no further explanation was needed. Care was not something reserved for broken things. It belonged to ordinary things as well. The walking stick did not need repairing. It simply deserved attention. Young eyes remembered that lesson. Not because it was spoken loudly. Because it was lived gently. The fire slowly settled into glowing embers. One by one, family members wished each other a peaceful night. Candles were gently extinguished. Outside, the stars stretched across the sky in quiet abundance. The hills rested beneath soft moonlight. The paths through the fields disappeared into darkness until morning returned. Another day had quietly completed its journey. It had not been remarkable. No traveler would carry news of it to distant cities. No writer would preserve it in elegant books. Yet within its ordinary hours, another young person had become a little more patient. A little more observant. A little more trustworthy. Like a tree adding one unseen ring beneath its bark, growth had continued without drawing attention to itself. And in the gentle order of that quiet world, that was more than enough. Morning arrived wrapped in a thin veil of clouds. The sunlight did not pour suddenly across the fields. Instead, it spread softly through the sky, turning the world into gentle shades of silver and pale gold. The rooftops still held the coolness of the night. Tiny drops of dew rested along the garden fence, and every blade of grass seemed to carry its own quiet jewel. The village stirred slowly. A dog stretched beside a stable door. A rooster called once, then settled into silence. Smoke rose from the first chimney, climbing straight into the still morning air. Inside the homes, another day was beginning exactly as countless days had begun before it. The fire was stirred. The table was prepared. The familiar rhythm continued. For a young person, one of the most comforting parts of life was knowing that each day carried a shape. The details changed. The weather changed. The seasons changed. But the shape remained. Morning belonged to preparation. Midday belonged to work. Evening belonged to home. Night belonged to rest. This pattern was repeated so faithfully that it became part of the heart. No one needed to think about it. The body simply followed. Years later, even after life changed in unexpected ways, many adults would still wake early without meaning to. The habits of youth settled deeply into them. After breakfast, the village slowly spread outward. Doors opened. People stepped onto familiar paths. Some walked toward fields. Others toward workshops. Others toward gardens already bright with growing vegetables. Children rarely wandered without purpose. Even the youngest often carried something. A basket. A bundle of kindling. A loaf of bread for a neighbor. A small pail. These simple tasks reminded them that everyone, no matter how young, contributed in some small way. Being useful was not considered extraordinary. It was simply part of belonging. One young girl walked with her grandmother toward the herb garden behind the house. The older woman carried a woven basket. The younger carried nothing at first. She wondered why. When they reached the garden, her grandmother smiled and handed her the basket. "You'll need both hands before we return." The girl nodded. Together they moved slowly among the plants. The grandmother touched each leaf carefully before picking it. Sometimes she left several stems untouched. Sometimes she gathered only one small sprig. The girl noticed this. "Why not take more?" Her grandmother smiled without looking up. "Because we'll want some tomorrow." The answer was quiet. Simple. Yet it carried a lesson much larger than herbs. Take what is needed. Leave enough for the future. The girl remembered those words long after the basket had been emptied. Elsewhere, a young apprentice followed a cooper who made wooden barrels. The workshop smelled of fresh timber, sawdust, and oak shavings. Light entered through a small window, falling across neatly stacked boards waiting to become something useful. The apprentice expected to spend the morning building. Instead, the cooper spent nearly an hour examining wood. He tapped one board gently. Rejected another. Turned a third over in his hands. Only after careful inspection did he begin working. The apprentice waited patiently. Finally he asked, "Why so long?" The cooper smiled. A rushed beginning becomes a difficult ending. Nothing more needed to be said. The young apprentice quietly watched every movement that followed. In homes throughout the village, similar lessons unfolded. A mother showed her son how to fold blankets so they would stay dry. A father explained why tools should always be returned to the same place. An older sister reminded her younger brother to close the garden gate behind him. None of these instructions sounded important by themselves. Yet together they formed the invisible threads holding daily life together. Order did not appear by accident. It grew from hundreds of careful habits repeated each day. The village path slowly became busier. Neighbors greeted one another warmly. No conversation lasted very long. Everyone had work waiting. Still, no greeting felt rushed. People asked about health. About families. About the weather. Sometimes they exchanged a loaf of bread or a handful of fresh herbs before continuing on their way. Young people watched these moments closely. Kindness often appeared in very small forms. A smile. A helping hand. A few shared vegetables. Simple gestures quietly strengthened the entire community. As the morning wore on, clouds drifted apart. Warm sunlight reached the fields. The grain moved gently in the breeze like waves across a quiet sea. Young shepherds watched their flocks from nearby hills. The sheep grazed peacefully. Lambs occasionally wandered too far before returning to their mothers. Nothing dramatic disturbed the afternoon. The greatest challenge often involved remaining attentive even when everything seemed calm. That, too, was part of growing older. Responsibility did not disappear simply because nothing unusual was happening. Carefulness mattered most during ordinary days. The village carpenter often said that wood revealed its secrets only to patient hands. Young apprentices smiled politely when they heard this. At first, they thought it sounded mysterious. After many months of work, they understood. A hurried cut could split a board. A patient one followed the grain. The difference lay not in strength. It lay in attention. This lesson echoed through nearly every trade. The baker watched the dough. The shepherd watched the flock. The gardener watched the weather. The healer watched the herbs. Observation became one of the quiet foundations of wisdom. By midday, the warmth encouraged everyone to pause. Children gathered beneath an old elm tree near the edge of the village. Their meal was simple. Fresh bread. Cheese. A few early berries gathered that morning. Cool water from the nearby well. No one hurried. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers growing beyond the fields. A butterfly landed briefly upon the grass before floating away again. One child pointed toward it. The others watched until it disappeared. Then they returned to eating. No one felt disappointed that the moment had been brief. Beautiful things often were. The afternoon brought smaller tasks. A fence post needed straightening. A wheel required tightening. Fresh straw was spread inside the stable. Young people learned that maintaining things prevented larger problems later. Repair before breaking. Care before neglect. These quiet habits shaped entire communities. Much of daily work involved preserving what already existed. Not everything needed replacing. Often, it simply needed attention. As shadows slowly lengthened, older villagers returned from the fields. Their pace remained steady. Not slow from weakness. Steady from experience. They had learned that hurrying at the end of the day rarely accomplished much. The work would continue tomorrow. There was comfort in knowing another sunrise would arrive. Young people gradually adopted this same rhythm. They stopped measuring a day by how quickly it passed. Instead, they measured it by whether the necessary work had been done with care. The evening meal gathered everyone once more beneath the same roof. Steam rose gently from a pot of vegetable stew. Fresh bread rested upon a wooden board. Butter softened beside the warmth of the fire. The youngest child proudly carried spoons to the table. An older brother poured water into clay cups. Their parents smiled quietly. Even these small responsibilities mattered. Each child belonged. Each child helped. After supper, the family remained together. Outside, twilight slowly settled across the village. The western sky glowed softly before fading into deep blue. Swallows made their final circles overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a cowbell rang gently as the last animals were brought safely home. Inside, the fire crackled with familiar warmth. The grandfather carefully repaired the handle of an old basket. The grandmother spun wool with calm, practiced hands. Their movements were slow. Almost effortless. Years of repetition had transformed work into something graceful. The older children watched while pretending not to. Without realizing it, they were already learning. Not through instruction. Through quiet example. When darkness finally wrapped itself around the village, silence returned little by little. One house extinguished its candle. Then another. Then another. The stars brightened overhead. The wind wandered softly through the tall grass beyond the last fence. Inside the homes, blankets were pulled close. The warmth of the day slowly faded into memory. Young minds drifted toward sleep carrying countless ordinary impressions. The scent of fresh cut wood. The sound of sheep grazing. The warmth of sunlight upon the fields. The gentle voice of a grandparent. The steady rhythm of familiar work. None of these moments seemed especially important while they happened. Yet together they quietly shaped a lifetime. In a world guided by patient order, childhood was not built from extraordinary days. It was built from ordinary ones, lived carefully, repeated faithfully, and remembered gently long after they had passed. The fire had grown quiet. Only a few glowing embers remained beneath the soft gray ash, offering a gentle warmth to the room. Outside, the village rested beneath a sky filled with patient stars. The fields, the forests, the winding paths, and the quiet river all settled into the peaceful silence of another completed day. The young people who had filled these pages with ordinary mornings and familiar evenings would continue to grow. Tomorrow they would rise before the sun once again. They would carry water, mend fences, gather firewood, tend gardens, care for animals, and sit beside the same family table. Little by little, the children would become trusted helpers. The trusted helpers would become parents. The parents would one day become the gray-haired elders whose gentle voices carried memories into another generation. Very little would happen all at once. Life would continue in its patient rhythm. The old apple tree would bloom each spring and rest each winter. The stream would continue its quiet journey over smooth stones. Smoke would rise from familiar chimneys each morning, disappearing into the open sky. Bread would bake. Wool would be spun. Seeds would disappear into the earth before returning as harvests months later. The order of the world was never perfect. Storms sometimes came without warning. Harvests sometimes disappointed. Illness sometimes visited even the most careful homes. Families mourned, worried, and endured. Yet they also discovered that kindness often grew strongest during difficult seasons. Neighbors shared what little they had. Hands reached out before they were asked. Quiet courage revealed itself not through grand speeches, but through simple acts repeated day after day. To be young in such a world was to inherit rhythms older than memory. It was to learn that patience often accomplished more than haste. That careful work became its own quiet reward. That respect could be shown through listening. That wisdom usually arrived one ordinary day at a time. Most of those young people never imagined that centuries later anyone would wonder about their lives. Their names faded. Their homes disappeared. The wooden tools wore away. The roads changed. The seasons, however, continued their gentle turning. And perhaps that is why their story still feels familiar. Every peaceful morning began with hope. Every evening ended with gratitude for work honestly done. Every generation quietly placed another small stone upon the foundation left by those before them. The world moved forward without rushing. Like a river that never forgot its course. Like the steady return of spring after winter. Like the soft glow of a fire waiting faithfully for another dawn. Now the village has fallen completely asleep. The last candle has gone dark. The wind moves gently through the trees beyond the fields. Somewhere, far away, an owl calls once before silence returns. The stars continue their slow journey across the night, just as they did for those young people so long ago. And with the warmth of the fading fire, the quiet village, and the steady rhythm of countless ordinary days, this gentle story comes to rest, leaving the peaceful world exactly as we found it, calm, patient, and waiting for another sunrise.